The Daviess County courthouse in Gallatin, Missouri, sits on the square in the middle of a town of 1,700 people. A brick building with a clock tower that has told the correct time for as long as anyone in the county can bother to verify. On the morning of August 12, 2019, the collector's office opened the room on the second floor at 8:30, set out a folding table with a numbered sign-in sheet, and arranged 17 plastic chairs in 4 rows, facing a lectern. By 9 o'clock, 14 of the chairs were filled. Anna Yoder signed in 5th. She had ridden to Gallatin with Tom Albright, age 58, who drove a white Ford pickup and charged $12 each way for trips from the Jamesport area to town. She had hired Tom 3 times before, twice for bank business and once to bring home fencing supplies too heavy for the buggy. He waited in the truck with a paperback novel and a thermos of coffee while she went inside. She took a seat in the second row. She was wearing a dark blue dress and a white cap, which was unremarkable anywhere in Daviess County, where the Amish community was large enough that its members moved through secular institutions without drawing sustained attention. What was more unusual, though no one said anything, was that she was the only woman in the room, and that she had come alone. The collector's office ran through 11 parcels between 9 and 10:40. Most moved quickly. A gas station lot in Gallatin with $12,000 in back taxes drew 4 bidders and sold for $22,000. A residential lot on the east side of town sold in 40 seconds to the only man who raised his hand. 3 parcels drew no bids at all and were passed to the county land trust. Anna wrote nothing during these. She held her composition notebook closed on her lap and watched the room. The Brubaker parcel was listed 12th. The collector, a heavy-set man named Roger Pace, read the legal description from his sheet. Parcel 0714 Southwoods 20 000 Daviess County, 43.2 acres, unimproved agricultural with a small area of timber edge. Assessed value $38,000. Outstanding taxes, penalties, and costs totaling $4,870. Minimum bid $4,870. He looked up. No one moved. One of the men in the back row, a farmer named Carl Dressler, who had bought 2 tax sale parcels in the county in the past decade, turned briefly to the man beside him and said something quiet. The man beside him shook his head once. Dressler did not raise his hand. Anna raised hers. Roger Pace wrote the figure, confirmed the bidder's name, and asked if anyone wished to raise. No one did. The parcel was sold in less than 90 seconds. Pace tore the receipt from a carbon copy pad and passed it across the folding table. Anna put the receipt in the front cover of her notebook without looking at it again. She thanked Roger Pace, nodded to the room, and walked downstairs and out into the August heat to find Tom Albright's truck. That evening, she wrote in the notebook, August 12th, bought $4,070, no other bids on it. Below that, after a line of space, she wrote the transfer and recording fees she had paid at the county clerk's window before leaving the building, $214. And below that, a single arithmetic line. Total in $5,074. She underlined the total once and closed the notebook. It had started 29 days earlier. On the afternoon of Sunday, July 14, 2019, Anna had driven her road buggy south from the farm she and her husband Eli worked on the edge of the Jamesport settlement and turned east on a gravel county road toward the Brubaker parcel. She had told Eli she was going to look at a piece of ground before stopping to visit the Huck-Stetler family on her way back. Eli was on a framing crew 3 days a week for an English contractor in Chillicothe, and on Sundays he rested. He had not asked many questions. He knew she had been reading the county collector's delinquent tax list, which she had requested as a public document 3 weeks earlier, and he knew which parcel she'd been thinking about. The Brubaker parcel had a reputation in the settlement. An Amish family had farmed it briefly in the late 1990s, long before Anna arrived in the district, and had given it up before the end of the second season. An English farmer named Brubaker had held the title for 11 years after that, tried it once in corn, and broken even in only one of those years. His son had inherited the title in 2013 and not paid $1 of tax since 2015. The ground itself had been empty since 2016, growing whatever volunteered. The name had stuck to it like a judgment. The Brubaker ground. Tight, wet in spring, hard as fired brick in August, not worth the diesel to work it. Anna had heard all of this. She had also ordered the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service soil survey sheets for the parcel from the extension office in Gallatin, and she had read them. She tied her horse at the fence post where the parcel's northwest corner met the gravel road and climbed through the wire. She was carrying a black and white composition notebook, a folding wooden rule, and a 36-inch Oakfield tube sampler, a hollow steel probe she had borrowed from the Daviess County Extension Office. Ruth Kinzer, the county agronomist, had loaned it to her without comment after Anna had spent an hour at the Extension Office 2 days earlier going over the soil survey printouts. The day was hot and partly cloudy, the kind of July afternoon in northern Missouri that feels heavier than the temperature alone would suggest. The field ahead of her was not entirely unworkable looking from the road. The upland portion was open and roughly level, maybe 28 acres of it, with a ragged stand of volunteer vegetation, some foxtail and horseweed, and a few scattered mulberry volunteers along the fence lines. It looked neglected. It did not, from the road, look obviously ruined. She walked north along the fence line first, counting paces. At 14 paces east of the north fence, she stopped and pushed the soil probe into the ground. The probe entered the topsoil cleanly. Dark, silty material, which was what she had expected. She twisted the handle and drove it down. At 17 inches, she felt the resistance change. The probe met something dense and unyielding, and she had to lean her full weight on it to continue. She extracted the core. The top 17 inches of the core was dark silt loam, well structured, with a faint earthy smell. Below the break, the material changed completely. The lower portion was dense, blocky clay, gray-brown in color with dark manganese mottling, small irregular patches of purple-black oxidized mineral that appear in soils that experience repeated cycles of saturation and drying. It was unmistakably the argillic horizon of a Laganda silt loam soil. The Clapham. She measured the break with her folding rule and wrote in her notebook, 17 inches to pan, north field. She pressed on south toward the draw. The draw ran northwest to southeast through the center of the parcel, a dry channel in July but clearly active in spring, its banks 4 to 6 feet high, where the seasonal flow had cut into the surrounding ground over decades. The brush along its margins was thick, willows, elderberry, a stand of silver maple downstream. She worked her way along the northwest bank, watching the cut faces. She found what she was looking for in the third exposed bank face she examined. The erosion had cut freshly there, perhaps in the past year, and the face was clean. At 31 inches below the surface of the upland field above, something protruded 2 inches from the cut face. She crouched and looked at it, then measured it with the folding rule. 4 1/4 inches in diameter. Clay, not plastic. The material was dense and hand-pressed, not the uniform extrusion of a modern manufactured tile. There was no date stamp, no manufacturer's mark. She used a stick to clear the soil from around the tile's face. The interior was clear of debris. She could see daylight approximately 8 inches into the bore before it turned or the light failed. She looked at the angle at which the tile entered the bank face. It was not horizontal. It ran slightly uphill into the bank, disappearing into the ground at a shallow angle that extended in her mind, would track northeast from where she stood, toward the worst draining quarter of the upland field. This was not a random piece of buried ceramic. Someone, most likely in the 1890s or early 1900s, when clay tile drainage was standard practice on northern Missouri farms, had laid a lateral drainage line through this field. The tile ran from the upland, where it would have intercepted water perching above the clay pen, down to the draw, where it was supposed to outlet into the open channel and carry the water away. But the tile ended here, 2 inches proud of a cut bank, with no structured outlet. Whatever had originally directed the tile's flow into the draw, a head wall, a stone apron, a simple ditch cut, had long since been destroyed by erosion. The water the tile was meant to carry had nowhere to go. For an unknown number of decades, the entire tile system above had been functioning as a trap, collecting perched water and holding it. She stood up and wrote in her notebook, "Old tile in drawbank, NW face, 31 in, depth, 414 in, dia, no outlet, barnyard grass patch approx, 0.4 AC center. This ground has been holding its own water above a tile system with no place to go. The tile is there, the outlet is not. Back taxes $4,870. Minimum bid same." She walked to the low center of the upland field before leaving. The barnyard grass patch was exactly where the soil survey's hydric indicator overlay had suggested she would find it. A dense, knee-high stand of Echinocloa crus galli, covering approximately 4/10 of an acre, the most visually reliable field indicator of seasonally saturated, poorly drained ground in the Missouri Till Plains. She pushed the probe into the center of the patch. Mottling began at 11 inches. The probe came out of the ground with a sulfurous smell, faint but distinct, the anaerobic signature of soil that spends significant time underwater. She drove a cedar stake into the ground at that spot and noted its position relative to a fence post 40 paces due east. She walked back to her buggy along the south fence line, passing close to the property boundary, and was nearly at the corner when a voice came from the next field north. Levi Hartman was at his fence line, watching. He was 61 years old, a third-generation Daviess County farmer, a large and deliberate man whose family had worked the ground on this road since before the current settlement was formally organized. He had watched the Brubaker parcel fail 2 owners in his adult memory. "You're looking at the Brubaker?" he called. Anna paused at the fence. "Just looking," she said. Levi took in the soil probe, the notebook, the measuring rule. "That ground's no good, Anna," he said. "I've watched it 40 years. He said it without cruelty, the way a man states a fact he has long since stopped needing to verify. Anna nodded. She climbed back through the wire to her horse. "I appreciate you saying so," she said, and she untied the horse and turned the buggy toward the Hochstetler place. 2 days later, she was back in Gallatin at the Daviess County Extension Office. Ruth Kinzer had been the county agronomist for 9 years. She was 44 years old, not tall, and had the manner of someone who had answered a great many questions about soil and had learned to distinguish quickly between the ones worth answering at length. She looked at the labeled paper bags Anna had brought, each one containing a core section from a different location on the Brubaker parcel, and she looked at the notebook entries describing the depths and locations. She opened the first bag and pressed the material between her fingers without saying anything for a moment. "Where's the pan on the north end?" she said. 17 inches. Ruth looked at the lower core section from that probe. "That's about right for Lagonda in this part of the county," she said. "Some of it's as shallow as 14. Some gets down to 22 before it hits. But 17 is typical." She set the core sample down on a piece of paper towel on her desk. "You said you found tile in the drawbank. 4 1/4 inches. Clay, no stamp. I think it's 1890s. Ruth was quiet for a moment. If there's a working lateral under that field and the outlet failed, that would explain the saturation pattern pretty well, she said. She pulled the web soil survey printout from the stack Anna had brought and traced her finger across the legend. Laganda silt loam, capability class that you with present conditions, which is what the survey shows now. That means the drainage limitation is what's holding this ground back. If you get that limitation addressed, even partially, you're talking about a Class 2W improvement. That's the difference between problem ground and productive ground, at least in a normal year. She said the next part carefully. I can't promise you that without a proper drainage study. That's the best I can tell you. I understand that, Anna said. Ruth looked at her for a moment, then picked up a stapled set of pages from her filing cabinet and handed it across the desk. It was the ENRCS Web Soil Survey printout for the Brubaker parcel, annotated by hand with the soil series boundaries. Take this with you, she said. If you do end up moving on this, come back and talk to me about tile spacing. There are extension bulletins on Laganda drainage that are worth having before you spend any money. Anna thanked her and put the printout in her notebook. On the morning of August the 12th, 29 days after she had found the tile end in the drawbank, she sat in the second row of the collector's room and raised her hand, and the 43.2 acres of the Brubaker parcel became hers for $4,870 in back taxes and $214 in recording fees, a total of $5,084. Her savings account at Daviess County Bank, which had held $11,400 the morning of the sale, held $6,316 by afternoon. She had $6,000 left. She had 43 acres of the worst reputed ground on this stretch of road. And she had a plan written in a composition notebook that came to, in its plainest form, a single sentence. Fix the outlet, open the pan, and let the ground do what the ground already wanted to do. The first piece of the plan was straightforward in concept and slightly less so in execution. To repair the tile outlet, she needed a trench from the point where the old tile terminated in the drawbank to the draw channel itself, approximately 60 feet of open cut at a depth that would pick up the tile's existing grade and carry it through to a functional outlet in the stream bed. A horse-drawn slip scraper could move earth, but a slip scraper works in shallow cuts and open ground. The drawbank was 4 feet deep in places, and the trench needed to reach 31 inches below the upland surface on one end and daylighted cleanly into the draw on the other. She needed someone with a machine. Gary Fenwick ran a small excavation and grading business out of a shop on the south side of Gallatin. He was 52 years old, and he had done work on farms throughout Daviess County for 2 decades, including work for several Amish operations. Anna reached him through a note left with Tom Albright, who knew him, and Fenwick came out to the Brubaker parcel on a Thursday afternoon in mid-September to look at the drawbank. He stood in the draw and looked at the tile end for a while. He was a man of few and practical words, which Anna found suitable. Clay tile's in decent shape from what I can see, he said. Might lose some joints when we open the trench, but we'll be able to tell. How far you want to run it? To the channel, Anna said. And I want the outlet end protected. A concrete head wall or equivalent. Something that keeps the bank from collapsing back over it. Fenwick looked at the 60 feet of drawbank between the tile end and the channel. Day's work, he said. I'll use a mini excavator, hand form the head wall, perforated HDPE connecting to your existing clay for the outlet section with a concrete collar, $1,200 materials included. Anna considered this. $1,140, she said. Fenwick looked at her, then he said, All right. He came in the first week of October 2019 when the draw was dry and the ground had firmed enough to work without making a mess of the bank. He cut the trench in 4 hours, working from the draw channel inward toward the bank face, When his bucket reached the old tile, he stopped the machine and Anna came down into the trench with him to look. The tile was intact for the full run. Several joints had slipped over the years, small gaps between sections where the original bedding had settled. But the bore was clear and the sections were sound. Fenwick laid 4-inch perforated HDPE from the channel end to the last intact joint of the clay tile, formed a simple concrete collar where the two materials met, and shaped the outlet at the draw face with a poured concrete headwall, a low rectangular structure the size of a large book, set flush with the bank and slightly above the low water line of the channel. He backfilled the trench, tamped it with the machine bucket, and was loaded and on the road back to Gallatin by 4 in the afternoon. Anna paid him $1,140 in cash from an envelope and watched him leave. She walked down into the draw and looked at the headwall for a long while. Nothing was flowing yet. The ground was dry and had been dry for weeks. But the connection was made. The tile system that had been collecting water with nowhere to send it for what she estimated was several decades now had a path out. She wrote in her notebook that evening, October 2019, Gary Fenwick finished the trench, tile running, draw flowing clear when it rains, head wall solid, 1,140 paid. Beneath that, total spent, 6,224. Savings remaining, 5,192. The winter was ordinary for Daviess County. The draw ran in November and again in a February thaw, and Anna drove her buggy out to the parcel twice to check the headwall. Both times the outlet was carrying flow cleanly into the channel, a modest but clear stream emerging from the concrete face and disappearing into the dry season draw. No debris, no back pressure. The tile was working. She came to the second piece of the plan in the same methodical way she had come to the first, which was by reading. The problem with a clay pan, once the perched water above it is given a path to drain, is that the pan itself remains. The argillic horizon, that dense, slowly permeable layer of eluviated clay at 17 inches under the Brubaker Grounds north field and 11 inches under its worst draining center, does not dissolve because it is no longer waterlogged. It remains dense, slowly permeable, and largely impenetrable to plant roots. Breaking it mechanically requires a subsoiler or a chisel plow pulled at sufficient depth and weight to fracture the pan, which in turn requires a tractor of the kind she could not own under her district's ordnung and could not afford to hire for 43 acres of unproven ground. She had read about alas. The word comes from the Spanish and refers to an unglazed clay vessel, traditionally used in arid region agriculture as a subsurface water source. The principle is simple. An unglazed clay pot buried in soil will seep water through its walls at a rate governed by the moisture differential between the water inside the vessel and the surrounding soil. When the soil is dry, the seepage rate is higher. When the soil approaches field capacity, the seepage slows. The result is a nearly zero runoff subsurface irrigation system that delivers water precisely where root pressure and moisture tension demand it. University of California researchers had documented the technique, and USDA papers had described its use in arid and semi-arid regions. Anna's application of the principle was not irrigation. The Brubaker ground did not lack water. What it lacked at the critical depth between 14 and 22 inches was biological activity, organic matter, and macropore structure. A clay pan in a northern Missouri silt loam is not a rock. It is a compacted clay mass that has lost most of its biological life because decades of saturation and anaerobic conditions have killed it. The tile outlet would stop the saturation, but the biology at that depth needed help to recover. She would bury vessels filled not with water but with composted manure and wood chip inoculant, a dense, biologically active material that would feed microbial populations at claypan depth, encourage fungal networks, and begin the slow process of reopening macropore channels through the pan from below. The vessels themselves would protect the material during burial and slow its incorporation into the surrounding soil, giving the biology time to establish before the organic matter dispersed. It was not an established agronomic protocol. It was an adaptation of a documented principle applied to a specific problem on a specific piece of ground by a woman who had read enough and thought about it long enough to believe it was worth trying. She needed vessels. She found a supplier through a connection at the Jamesport Market, a Mennonite pottery operation in Seymour, Missouri, 2 hours south, that produced unglazed clay pots primarily for garden and culinary use. The owner agreed to sell her 350 vessels at $4.80 each, a bulk price for an order that large. Total cost, $1,680. She worked the grid on paper through the winter, measuring the worst affected upland area from the soil probe data and the indicator plant observations she had mapped in July. The low center and the northeast quarter of the upland field, where modeling had appeared at 11 and 14 inches respectively, represented approximately 3.8 acres. At a grid spacing of 11 feet by 11 feet across that area, 350 vessels covered the acreage with modest overlap at the margins. She drew the grid in the back of her notebook on graph paper, squared to scale, and labeled each row with a letter and each position in the row with a number. The vessels arrived in 2 loads on a borrowed flatbed wagon in late April 2020, stacked in wooden crates and cushioned with straw. Anna signed the delivery paperwork and stacked the crates in the equipment shed at the Brubaker parcel, which still stood at the south edge of the property, a post and beam structure that was sound enough to use for storage, even if it needed work before it could house animals. She had asked 2 women from her district if they would help with the installation in exchange for labor. She would return to them in kind over the following season. Mary Beachy was 29, the wife of a market gardener, and was accustomed to field work. Sarah Troyer was 36 and had helped install cold frames and hoop houses on 3 other operations in the settlement. Neither of them had buried clay pots in a farm field before, but they had each listened to Anna's explanation and said they understood the idea. They began on the second Monday of May, a cool morning with a cloud cover that made the work tolerable. The method was straightforward. Anna had marked the grid with small wooden stakes the week before, working alone over 2 evenings. At each stake, one of the 3 women dug a hole 18 inches deep using a sharpened tile spade, set the vessel in the hole with its neck at the surface, filled the vessel with the compost and wood chip mixture from a bucket, covered the neck with a small flat stone to limit evaporation, and moved to the next stake. 350 holes, 3 women, 4 days. They were on the 3rd day, a Wednesday, when Levi Hartman stopped his cultivator team at the fence line. He had a team of 2 chestnuts he used for field cultivation, good steady horses who did not spook easily, and he stopped them with a word and stood in the seat of his cultivator and looked across at the 3 women moving systematically across the field, each one carrying a bucket and a spade, stopping at wooden stakes and digging. The field looked from the road like something between a garden project and a burial. Levi said, "What are those?" Anna looked up from where she was setting a vessel. "Clay pots," she said. A pause. "You're burying clay pots." "We are," Anna said. She straightened and came to the fence line and explained briefly and plainly the composted fill, the clay pan depth, the biological logic. She said it in the same tone she might use to explain why she was planting a cover crop or adjusting her row spacing, because to her it was equally practical. Levi listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then he clicked his tongue at the chestnuts and drove the team on down the field. That evening, according to 2 members of Anna's district who heard it from a cousin, Levi stopped at the Jamesport hardware store on his way home. and told the men there that Anna Yoder was burying flower pots in the Brubaker ground. He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way he had said, at the fence line in July of the previous year, that the ground was no good, as a fact that had already been settled. The men in the hardware store laughed, and the story moved through the settlement the way small stories do, pleasantly and without malice, like a footnote to the long history of that particular parcel. Mary Beachy and Sarah Troyer finished the last row on the fourth day, a Friday afternoon, while a light rain moved through from the northwest. Anna drove the final stake and set the final flat stone and stood up and looked at the field. 350 vessels, 11-foot spacing, 3.8 acres of the worst affected upland ground, each vessel sitting at 18 inches of depth, with its neck at the surface and its body surrounded by the most biologically active material she had been able to source. The cereal rye cover crop she had seeded the previous October was thick and green around every stake. The tile was running in the draw. The head wall was clear. She had spent in total $5,084 to acquire the parcel, $1,140 on the tile outlet, $1,680 on the vessels, and $645 on cover crop seed. She owed Mary Beachy and Sarah Troyer labor, not money. She had spent no money on fuel, no money on fertilizer, and no money on custom fieldwork beyond Fenwick's Trench. Her total outlay was $8,549. Her remaining savings were $2,851. She had not yet harvested a dollar from the ground. She had not planted a cash crop. She would not plant one this year. The first season after tile installation on a clay pan soil, according to the extension bulletins Ruth Kinzer had given her, was a season to let the drainage establish and to build organic matter at depth. A cash crop planted in the first year would yield poorly and would compress the vessels before the surrounding soil had settled around them and accepted them. She knew this. She had planned for it. She wrote in her notebook that Friday evening, 350 in the ground. The neighbors think I've gone simple. She did not write what she actually thought, which was that she had put everything she had earned in 6 years of market garden work into 43 acres of ground that no one else had wanted, and that she would not know for at least 18 months whether she had read the evidence correctly. What she had was a tile end in a drawbank, a soil probe core in a paper bag, a notebook full of measurements, and a grid of 350 clay vessels sitting in the dark below a field of cereal rye in the rain. The cereal rye came out of the winter thick and even, which was the first thing that told her something had changed. She had seeded it at 2 bushels per acre across all 43 acres in October 2019, shortly after Fenwick finished the trench, working with a borrowed horse-drawn broadcast seeder that Eli had hauled out from the Troyer farm on a flatbed wagon. Cereal rye is not a demanding crop. It germinates in cold soil and holds ground through a northern Missouri winter without much encouragement. But the stand on the Brubaker parcel in March 2020 was notably uniform across the upland field, including the low center where the barnyard grass patch had been. In past years, that low center would have shown winterkill or thin stands from the ice sheeting that forms when water ponds on saturated ground and freezes in place. The rye there was as thick as anywhere else on the field. Anna noted this in February when she drove the buggy out during a midwinter thaw to check the tile outlet. The draw was running, a clear, modest flow coming from the head wall and moving south through the channel. She crouched at the outlet and watched it for a moment. The flow was not dramatic. It was the kind of flow that would have been invisible if you did not know what it meant, which was that the ground above was releasing water. It had previously had no path to release, moving it through a clay tile system that had been laid by someone a century before her and had been waiting, without a functioning outlet, ever since. She drove back home without writing anything down. Some observations did not require a notebook entry. By the time she and the neighbor women installed the vessels in May 2020, the tile had been running through 2 significant spring rains and the low center of the upland field, which had historically ponded for 3 to 5 weeks each spring according to the memory of anyone she had asked about it, had not ponded at all that year. The water moved. The field dried. She noted the planting date of the cover crop's termination and the condition of the soil at tillage depth when she ran a single pass with the horse-drawn cultivator in late May to terminate the rye. The tilth at 6 inches was noticeably better than she had expected from a first-year claypan field. Not good ground yet, but ground that was beginning to breathe. She left the field in cover crop through the rest of 2020, seeding a warm season mix of cowpea and sorghum Sudan grass after the rye termination, both species chosen for their ability to push deep roots into compacted subsoil and contribute large quantities of organic matter. The sorghum Sudan grass roots would not penetrate the claypan at 17 inches, but they would reach it, pressing against it, adding to the biological pressure at that boundary alongside the vessels working from below. She didn't plant a cash crop in 2020. She had planned for this. It didn't make it easier. Eli asked her once that August how long she intended to carry the ground without revenue. She told him 1 more season. He nodded and went back to his work. He was not a man who needed to be convinced of patience. He had watched her keep the market garden accounts for 6 years, and he knew how she thought about numbers, which was carefully and over a long time horizon. In the spring of 2021, she planted soybeans. She chose soybeans for the first cash crop for the reasons the Extension Bulletin recommended. Soybeans fix nitrogen, tolerate moderate drainage imperfection better than corn in a transitional year, and carry lower input costs. She seeded 24 of the 43 acres in row crop, leaving the draw area and the timber edge in permanent cover and the south field in a 3rd year of building rotation. Seed cost her $48 per acre across 24 acres, a total of $1,152. She hired Larry Hendricks, an English farmer 2 miles east on the same road, to custom combine the crop in October. Larry was 48 years old and ran a late model combine he hired out to several Amish and Mennonite operations in the county at $40 per acre. His rate for 24 acres came to $960. The inoculant for the soybean seed, a rhizobium product applied at planting to ensure nitrogen fixation, cost $96 from the co-op in Gallatin, where Anna had an account. She was in the cab of Larry Hendricks's combine exactly once, when he offered to show her the yield monitor display as he made the first pass through the north field. She stood on the platform outside the cab door and watched the screen. The monitor updated in real time as the head moved through the standing beans, and the numbers it displayed were not the numbers she had feared and not the numbers she had hoped for. They were something between honest numbers from a field in its first year of genuine transition. Larry ran the full 24 acres over 2 days in the first week of October. When he handed her the load tickets and the combine's summary sheet, the average yield across the field was 41 bushels per acre. She sat with that figure at the kitchen table that evening. 41 bushels per acre on 24 acres was 984 total bushels. She sold at the Chillicothe elevator at the October cash price, which was $13.20 per bushel. Total gross revenue, $13,373. She laid the revenue figure against her cumulative costs. Acquisition, $5,084. Tile outlet, $1,140. Vessels, $1,680. Cover crop seed, $645. 2021 seed and inoculant, $1,248, combining $900 to $60. Total invested through the end of 2021, $10,757, $13,373 in revenue against $10,757 in costs. A net positive position of $2,616, covering all 2.5 years of investment with money remaining. She wrote in her notebook, October 2021, 41, Bew soybeans, 24 acres, $13,373 gross, all costs paid back. She did not use an exclamation point. She was not a woman who used exclamation points in her ledger entries, but she read that line twice before she closed the notebook. In November of that year, she made an appointment with Dennis Calvert at Daviess County Bank in Gallatin. She did not need a loan. She wanted to establish a file. Dennis was 51 years old and had been a loan officer at the bank for 14 years. He had a careful, thorough manner and a deep familiarity with Daviess County agricultural parcels, which in practice meant he knew the reputations of most pieces of ground in the county by name. He knew the Brubaker parcel by name. Anna sat across his desk and opened her notebook and walked him through the acquisition, the drainage work, the vessel installation, and the first year's yield, in the same order and with the same precision she had used to plan it. She showed him the load tickets from Hendricks. She showed him Ruth Kinzer's extension letter, a single paragraph on county extension letterhead confirming the Laganda soil series identification, the claypan depth, and the drainage improvement is documented by Anna's records and one follow-up site visit Kinzer had made in the summer of 2021. The letter did not editorialize. It stated what Kinzer had observed. Dennis reviewed the documents for several minutes without speaking. Then he said, "You bought the Brubaker ground for $4,870, plus recording fees," Anna said. $5,084 total. He looked at the yield records again. "I'd want to see a second year before I could do much with this," he said. 2 years of yield documentation on improved ground. I can work with that. Come back next fall." "I intend to," Anna said. She thanked him and left. The winter of 2021 into 2022 was dry in northern Missouri. The snowpack was below average, and by March it was clear the spring recharge of the soil profile would be short. County agricultural reports in April noted that subsoil moisture readings across Daviess County were running 15 to 20% below the 10-year average. The Extension Office sent an advisory in May, noting drought watch conditions across the northern Missouri till Plains and recommending that row crop producers scout carefully for early moisture stress indicators. Anna planted corn on the Brubaker ground in May 2022. She chose corn for the second cash crop because a corn-soybean rotation is the agronomic standard for northern Missouri till Plains soils, and because the 2022 corn-to-soybean price ratio favored corn at planting time. Seed cost her $112 per acre across 24 acres, a total of $2,688. She used a horse-drawn 2-row planter she had purchased second-hand from an Amish operation in the Miriam district, a cast-iron implement that was older than she was, and placed seed with a precision that newer equipment did not always match. June was dry. July was drier. The drought that settled over northern Missouri in the summer of 2022 was not the worst in recent county history, but it was significant. Daviess County recorded below normal precipitation in 5 of the 7 weeks between mid-June and early August. Temperatures in July averaged 3.2 degrees above the 30-year mean. The County Extension Office issued a drought impact advisory in late July, noting that corn yield potential across the county had been substantially reduced, with the most severe impacts on poorly drained and shallow-rooted ground where the crop had not been able to access subsoil moisture reserves. Anna watched her field through June and July from the road and from within the rows. corn under moisture stress rolls its leaves, curling them lengthwise to reduce the surface area exposed to the sun and slow transpiration. A field of rolling corn in the morning before the day's heat has built is a field in significant stress. She watched for this. On the morning of July 28th, she drove the buggy out to the Brubaker parcel before 6 o'clock and walked into the standing corn. The plants were tasseling, the pollen shedding beginning. The leaves were not rolling. She walked to the low center of the field, to the area where the barnyard grass patch had been, now buried under corn that stood 8 feet tall and was as uniform as anything she had put in the ground. She put her hand on a stalk, firm, well knotted, no sign of fired leaves at the lower canopy. She walked to the fence line. Across the road and one property north, Levi Hartman's cornfield was visible from where she stood. His ground was unimproved Lagonda silt loam on the north quarter, the same soil series as hers, the same claypan depth range, the same history of drainage limitation. His corn was rolling, not severely but visibly, the leaves curling at the margins in the pre-dawn cool, which meant that by midday the field would be under pronounced stress. The color was beginning to go, the deep green fading toward the yellow-gray of a crop, drawing down its last chlorophyll reserves to keep itself alive. She stood at the fence for a while. Then she walked back to the cedar stake she had driven into the low center of her field in July 2019. The stake was still there. 3 years of weathering had grayed the wood and driven it slightly crooked, but it was there. She pulled the soil probe from the loop she had rigged on the back of the buggy seat for field work and pushed it into the ground at the base of the stake. The probe moved through the topsoil and into the subsoil. She felt the resistance change as it always did, the transition from open structured soil into the denser material below. She drove it to its full 36-inch depth and extracted the core. She measured from the top of the core to where the mottling began, the gray-brown clay with the manganese staining that marked where the soil spent time saturated. In July 2019, mottling had begun at 11 inches at this spot. She measured now, 26 inches. The mottling boundary had dropped 15 inches in 3 years. Below the new mottling line, the core was still dense, still clay-dominated. The claypan had not dissolved. But above it, where there had been gray mottled clay at 11 inches, there was now 15 additional inches of soil that was cycling through normal aerobic conditions, that roots were penetrating, that was holding moisture in the rooting zone rather than becoming a saturated barrier above a perched water table. She held the core for a moment and looked at it. Then she looked at the corn above her, tasseling cleanly in the early morning air, and at Levi's field across the fence, and at the draw behind her where the head wall she had paid Gary Fenwick $1,140 of $40 to pour 3 years ago was sitting quietly in the bank, doing what it was built to do. She put the core sample back in the ground, tamped the soil around the stake, and walked back to the buggy. She wrote in her notebook that evening, same spot, pan dropping, no smell. Larry Hendricks ran the combine through the Brubaker corn in the first week of October 2022. Anna did not ride the platform this time. She waited at the edge of the field with a thermos of coffee and watched the machine move through the rows. When Larry came to the end of a pass and swung around at the headland, she could see the yield monitor screen through the glass if she stood in the right place, and the numbers on it were not in the range she had planned for in her conservative projection. They were higher. When Larry pulled up at the field edge at the end of the second day and climbed down with the summary sheet, he handed it to her and said, "That's a good field, Mrs. Yoder." The average yield across 24 acres was 148 bushels per acre. She looked across the fence at Levi Hartman's north quarter. Levi had told her his yield 2 days earlier, over the fence without being asked. He had volunteered it, she thought, because he wanted her to have the number. His combine, hired from the same English operator who covered the east side of the road, had run his north quarter and averaged 87 bushels per acre, 148 against 87. The same soil series, the same weather, the same seed population. The difference was a broken tile outlet repaired in October 2019, a concrete head wall that had cost $1,140, and 350 clay vessels sitting at 18 inches of depth in the low center and northeast quarter of the upland field. She sold at the Chillicothe elevator at the October 2022 cash price of $6.75 per bushel. 24 acres at 148 bushels per acre was 3,552 bushels total. At $6.75, gross revenue was $23,976. She subtracted the combining cost, $45 per acre for 24 acres, $1,080, and the seed cost, $2,688. Net revenue from the 2022 corn crop, $20,208. Added to the net positive position she had carried out of the 2021 soybean year, $2,616, her cumulative net across all years of the project stood at $22,824. Her total cash invested from savings had been $10,757. She had recovered that investment and returned a net of $22,824 on top of it, from a parcel she had purchased for the cost of its back taxes. She called Mark Svoboda's office from the community phone shanty on the road. Mark Svoboda was a certified general appraiser based in Chillicothe, 47 years old, who had been appraising agricultural parcels in Daviess and surrounding counties since 2009. He came out to the Brubaker parcel on an October morning, 2 weeks after harvest, driving a late-model sedan that he parked on the gravel road edge. He walked the field with Anna for the better part of 2 hours, which was longer than most appraisal site visits she had heard about. He asked about the tile work first. She showed him the head wall in the drawbank, and he crouched and looked at it, and she told him the installation date and the cost. He wrote both in his notes. He asked about the vessels, and she walked him to the low center of the field and pointed at the rows of flat stones still visible at 18-inch intervals across the surface, each one covering a vessel neck. She explained the method plainly as she had explained it to Levi Hartman over the fence 2 years before. Svoboda listened and wrote. He did not say whether he had seen the method before. He asked to see the yield documentation, and she handed him the load tickets from both years, 2021 and 2022, and the summary sheets from Larry Hendricks's combine. He looked at the 2022 figure for a moment. 148 on this ground, he said. Not a question. She told him about Levi's 87 across the fence. He wrote that down as well, with a note about the comparable soil series. Before he left, he asked to take a copy of Ruth Kinzer's extension letter. Anna had brought a second copy for this purpose. His report arrived at the Daviess County Bank addressed to Dennis Calvert, with a copy mailed to Anna in the third week of November 2022. The appraised value of the Brubaker parcel, parcel 0714 to 22,000,000, Daviess County, Missouri, as of October 2022, was $118,000, representing a per-acre value of $2,731. The report noted the soil series as Laganda silt loam, the drainage improvement as documented and verified, the yield history as consistent with Class 2W improved ground, and the subsurface amendment method as unusual and unduplicated in comparable sales but producing documented and verifiable yield results. Under comparable sales, Svoboda had pulled 2 recent transactions involving tile-drained Laganda series ground in the county both selling in the range of $2,600 to $2,800 per acre, and had bracketed the Brubaker parcel within that range. The original assessed value, at the time Anna had signed in at the collector's office in August 2019, had been $38,000. Dennis Calvert approved an operating line of credit at $60,000, secured by the Brubaker parcel, at an interest rate of 6.75% in December 2022. He wrote in his loan file, which Anna saw when she signed the documents, a note in the security description field. Improved cropland, tile drained, verified by county extension, yield history, 2021, 2092, consistent with Class 2W. He did not mention the vessels. He valued what he could measure, which was what the ground produced. It was enough. On an evening in late November, 10 days after the appraisal report arrived, Anna heard a knock at the door of the farmhouse. She opened it to find Levi Hartman standing on the porch step, his hat in both hands. He was a large man, and he looked, standing on the step with his hat held at his waist, slightly smaller than usual. He said he was sorry to come without sending word. She told him it was no trouble and asked if he wanted to come in. He sat at the kitchen table. Eli was reading in the other room and did not come in. Levi did not approach the subject sideways. He said he had been thinking about his north quarter since the harvest, and that he had pulled the soil probe records he kept in his own barn ledger and looked at them again, and that the clay pan on his north quarter ran at 16 to 19 inches, which was the same range as her ground. He said he had watched her corn in the drought this summer, and then watched his own combine summary when it came off, and that there was a conclusion to those two numbers that he did not see a way to avoid. He asked if he could see the notebook. She put it on the table in front of him. He read it from the beginning, slowly. He was not a fast reader in English, and he moved his finger under some of the lines. When he reached the July 2019 entry, the first entry, the one that described the soil probe readings and the tile end in the drawbank and the arithmetic of the minimum bid, he stopped and read it twice. He asked about the pottery supplier in Seymour. She gave him the name and told him the bulk price she had paid, $4.80 per vessel, and told him the supplier had recognized her voice on the phone by the time she placed the second order. She told him the grid spacing she had used and why, and told him that for his ground, which was a slightly larger area of severe clay pan limitation based on what he was describing, he might want to walk the parcel with a probe first and map the worst zones before he committed to a spacing. He took out his own small pocket ledger, a thin thing with a brown cover, and copied figures into it. He worked slowly and wrote in Dutch. He copied the probe depths, the tile installation cost, the vessel count, the grid spacing, the pottery supplier's name, and the 2022 yield figure. He copied Svoboda's appraised value, and next to it he wrote the purchase price, $5,084, and drew a line between them. He sat with that line for a moment. Then he closed his ledger, thanked her, picked up his hat, and walked back out into the dark. The following spring, Anna heard from Mary Beachy, who had heard from her husband, who had seen it from the road, that Levi Hartman had hired a Gallatin excavation contractor to cut a tile outlet trench in the draw on the east side of his north quarter. March came cold and clear to Daviess County. The frost was still in the ground in the mornings, but by the middle of the month the air above the fields carried the first thin warmth of a new planting season. Anna drove the buggy out to the Brubaker parcel before 7 on a Thursday morning, ahead of the dad's work, with no particular errand in mind. She tied the horse at the northwest fence post, the same post she had used on a July Sunday 4 years before, and climbed through the wire and walked south across the field. The rye cover crop she had seeded in October was 3 inches high, and even across the upland, including the low center. She walked to the cedar stake at the barnyard grass site. The stake was weathered now, its wood gone silver gray, leaning a few degrees off vertical. She pushed the soil probe into the ground at its base without recording the depth she intended to take. She drove it to its full extent, extracted it, and looked at the core without measuring it immediately. The top of the core was dark, loose, friable. She ran her thumb along the length of it. The mottling, the gray-brown clay with the manganese staining, was deep in the core, well below the midpoint. She held the probe vertical and estimated 27, 28 inches. She did not write the number. She held the core for a moment longer, smelling it. There was no sulfurous smell. The core smelled of damp earth and rye roots and something faintly organic, the smell of a soil that was alive to a depth that it hadn't been alive to in July of 2019. She set the core on the ground and walked to the draw. The head wall was where it had always been. The concrete face was stained with 3 winters of mineral seepage, darkened at the edges where the clay bank met the pour. The tile bore was clear. The draw was running its early spring flow, snowmelt from the north moving through the channel, and the outlet was contributing its thread of water to the stream, steady and modest and entirely unremarkable to anyone who had not stood in this draw in July of 2019 and found a clay tile terminating in a cut bank with nowhere to go. She looked at the tile end for a while. Somewhere in the 1890s, a person she would never know had understood what this ground needed and had begun the work of giving it to the ground. That person had laid clay tile, section by section, through a field that grew tight and wet above a clay pan, and had run it to this drawbank, and had built whatever outlet structure existed then, and at some point the outlet had failed, and the person had died, and the understanding had died with them, and the ground had gone on holding its own water above a broken system for the better part of a century, accumulating a reputation that had nothing to do with what the soil actually was, and everything to do with a problem that no one had correctly diagnosed. She had diagnosed it in an afternoon with a borrowed soil probe and a composition notebook. She walked back to the buggy, untied the horse, and turned toward home. The notebook entry she wrote that evening was the last one she would write about the Brubaker ground for some time, not because the work was finished. There was always more work, but because the question the notebook had been built to answer had been answered. She wrote, March 2023, same ground, different ground. The Brubaker parcel, which had sold at a Daviess County delinquent tax auction in August 2019 for $4,870 in unpaid taxes, appraised 3 years later at $118,000. The difference between those two numbers was not luck, and it was not the ground itself. It was a tile end found in a cut bank and a conclusion drawn from it, and the patience to act on the conclusion precisely and wait for the ground to confirm it. No one laughed when they saw the corn in August 2022. If you're finding these useful, there's a subscribe button below. One decision a week with the real numbers.